Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. Thanks for tuning in today. You know, one of the things that I think we can all do a better job at is really challenging conventional wisdom. And I don't mean being a professional skeptic who's pushing back on every point that is advocated for by somebody or challenging every notion or idea or assumption. I don't want to be antagonistic, but I do think that in the world of business, in the world of ag, in the world generally, there's a lot of commonly held and rarely challenged folk wisdom out there. And sometimes it's even ostensibly supported by statistics or credible research or some kind of a credible source. And when we don't challenge these things, we don't look at them closely, they kind of become these empty platitudes. The ones that are most prevalent, they get the most traction, they kind of speak to an attractive notion, convenient thought, maybe they're a little bit provocative. They tend to grab attention. They usually inspire a response. And so again, there's a lot of reasons that we gravitate towards certain notions or ideas or statements or commonly held truths, but we don't really challenge or explore them. And so what am I talking about? Well, one of the things in the world of mergers and acquisitions that you'll see a lot of folks saying in social media posts and in articles, we've even said it on this podcast in full transparency, is this idea that 70 to 90% of all M&A deals fail to deliver value. Or even more sort of provocatively, that 70 to 90% of M&A deals actually destroy value. And so this has been something that, again, been said, it's been resaid, it's been amplified, it gets recirculated. And I think it's one of those things that we need to take a look at. Now, approximately a year ago or so, I don't know what episode it was in, I looked into this because I was challenged by a listener to say, what's the birth of that statistic? And what I found at that time, doing some armchair research, admittedly, in the margins of my day, is I found very little quantitative support or any sort of credible citations to the original study, which could then lead me to question the wisdom of the result. I ran into dead ends, and I didn't know, where does this come from? I experienced a lot of, this article referencing this article, which referenced this article, and it sort of seemed like they were amplifying the message, but again, never being able to get back to an actual study. Now, over the last 12 to 18 months, large language models and the search functionality and capabilities that they enable have improved considerably, as I'm sure you're all aware. And so part of a debate that came up again earlier this year and exploration of ideas I was having with a fellow agribusiness nerd over email, shout out Shane Thomas from Upstream Ag, I decided to take another crack at this and thought, there's no way that we all just believe this statistic that 79% of deals destroy value. There's no way we just believe this without there being some kind of support for it. And what I've learned over the last couple of months looking at this is pretty interesting. And I think it's relevant both as a reference point in the risk versus reward calculus around M&A, but I think also for how we treat commonly held truths more generally. And that's what I'd like to dedicate today's episode to. And to do that, I want to structure today's discussion as follows. I want to talk about what the point of origin was for the notion that M&A destroys more value than it creates. What was the original testing and study that arrived at that analysis? I want to dig into what was happening behind those sets of facts. What was the macroeconomic environment in which the study was conducted? What were the assumptions that were made? And also, what was the sample size that actually was used to drive to that conclusion, that infamous conclusion now that we all hold on to so dearly? And then lastly, I want to tie it off with saying, okay, what is the implications of this point in time study to agribusiness today, and specifically to agribusiness M&A? Because again, I think not just playing with the intellectual idea of, are we putting too much weight on dated or perhaps untested quote unquote facts that are out there in the market, but also want to look at this analysis and then apply it to M&A today in 2025 in agribusiness. So let's get started. What was the point of origin of the notion that 70 to 90% of M&A either fails to deliver or outright destroys value? Again, the statistic is widely cited, and in my initial research, it seemed to originate from multiple sources over time rather than from a single definitive study. However, this time, as I took a crack at it and perhaps spent a little bit more time and put some more rigor on the analysis, I was able to actually come back to perhaps the earliest and most influential mention of that statistic. And it came from a 1999 KPMG report titled Unlocking Shareholder Value: The Keys to Success. Now, the study found that 83% of mergers did not boost shareholder returns and suggested that with the remaining 17%, that a relatively marginal slice of overall M&A activity was actually additive to shareholder value. Now, this, I believe, is probably the inception of that widely held but rarely challenged belief of M&A value destruction. It's a belief that I myself have taken at face value for years. So take us back to 1999. Now let's think about the study itself. It then went on to be amplified or reiterated or supported in subsequent research that happened. Just 5 years after the KPMG report, McKinsey & Company in 2004 found in one of their reports that only 23% of mergers beat industry benchmarks on shareholder return. Now, that's pretty damning. Less than a quarter of them will beat industry benchmarks. It doesn't necessarily mean that it destroys value or fails to deliver value, but it's somewhat muted and kind of still falls into that 70 to 90% range of not really meeting expectations. Several years later after that, a Harvard Business Review report from 2011 said outright that 70 to 90% of M&A deals fail. And they often cited integration difficulties and cultural clashes as some of the main contributors to that. So while 1999 is a key year due to KPMG's pivotal report, that 70 to 90% failure rate is something that seems to get reiterated, gets more traction, gets echoed in the decades since, based on similar analysis by consulting firms and some academic bodies. Now, for those of you that are interested, I intend to link to the 1999 KPMG report in the show notes so you can download the PDF. You can read about the findings in more detail. You can understand the methodology and also read their 6 keys to success, which include things like synergy evaluation, integration planning, resolving cultural issues, and strong communications as ways to actually improve returns and sort of pointing to what did those deals that actually were additive feature relative to the ones that did not deliver value. So I think that for me was helpful to kind of go back and say, okay, in the last 15 to 25 years, where did this information originate from? But if I go back to 1999, again, the original sin of the idea, if you will, we have to think about what are the conditions and the facts behind the stats. And that requires us to look at the environment then, as well as the report itself a little bit more closely. I want to be clear here. It's super easy for me to sit here and criticize someone else's work, especially safely at a distance from a microphone in a house in the countryside, but even more importantly, more than 25 years removed from when that work was conducted. That's not my objective today. It's not to armchair quarterback. It's not to poke holes. It's simply to analyze it in the context of how relevant the findings and conclusions are to the work that we're all doing today. So again, to be clear, my objective here is to see if the idea of M&A value destruction holds up today, not if it was true in 1999. Okay, I'm not challenging the study itself. So if you look at the KPMG report, you'll see that it analyzed 700 major global M&A transactions in a 3-year period from 1996 to 1998. Now, this is a large, and in my layman's perspective, a large and broad, statistically significant sample size. What I think maybe one of the challenges is it's over a relatively narrow period of time, 96, 97, 98. Now, for obvious reasons, KPMG did not publish the list of companies that they talked to. They did not list the transactions that were analyzed. And in my work, I've not been able to sort of forensically or retroactively be able to recreate what that list might have been. There's some different ways you could try, but there's no conclusive way to say these are the folks that they talked to, these are the companies they looked at. But we do know a little about how they got the data, since that's actually shared in the approach section of the paper. They did it in 2 phases. Phase 1 was a series of confidential phone interviews with board members, what they called main board members, so actively engaged in the deals, board members from 107 companies. And those 107 were represented in that 700 company or 700 transaction sample size that the report was based upon. So they did the interviews with 170 individuals. And then for phase two, they actually did more of a quantitative analysis, and they used external share price data via Bloomberg to benchmark deal performance via shareholder value approximately 1 year after completion and closure of the deals. And that 1 year mark was where they really sort of said, okay, has this created value? Has this destroyed value? Or has it been relatively neutral over that period? Now, one obvious challenge we have that I want to name and get out of the way is that we have no way of knowing what proportion of these deals involved agribusiness or even agriculturally adjacent companies, OEMs that might have an agricultural division, for example, or pharmaceutical companies that maybe had synthetic chemistry product manufacturing for the agricultural industry. We just don't know because it's not available. A lack of ag representation in that data set does not mean, of course, that the findings would not be repeated in our industry. But I want to call it the fact that we simply don't have a way of knowing how many, if any, of these would be what we conventionally think of as ag supply chain or ag value chain companies. I would suspect during that period that there's some large CPG food and bev deals in the sample, given the timing again, but we don't really know. That said, let's think about how to reconcile conditions in 1996 and 98 to what the world and the ag economy looks like today. And this is really the important piece, even more important than the method by which they collected and analyzed data, or even if the sample size included ag companies. What was the economic growth picture like in the period of 96 to 98? Economic growth in the United States during that period was strong and stable and sort of part of that late 1990s economic boom that was driven by technological innovation related to the internet, rising productivity broadly across the economy, and really low inflation. So let's put some numbers to it. US real GDP growth, in terms of an annual percentage change year on year, in 1996, GDP growth was at 3.8% roughly. In 97 is at 4.4. In 1998 was at 4.5. So we're looking at some serious economic growth numbers, things that we would really be excited about if they were sustainably delivered today. And these numbers reflect the tailwinds and sort of that structural support for growth that was in place. Now, what do I mean by that? For those of us that were old enough to be paying attention, I was old enough. I should have been paying attention, probably not paying as much attention as I would prefer now. But this was a period of rapid technological and information economy expansion, the tech-driven expansion that preceded that dot-com bust that was to come in late 99 and early 2000. During the period 96 and 98, unemployment dropped nearly 100 basis points over the period from about 5.4% in 96 to around 4.5% by 98. So while unemployment was maybe higher than we've seen in more recent periods, where we've had very, very low unemployment rates, it was still a significant drop during the period. So think about that. Rising productivity, unemployment dropping, GDP growth going up, real kind of frothy boom times, a lot of reason for optimism. And coupled with this was a low inflation environment, according to the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which averaged no more than 2.3% per year during the period. And then this is perhaps, consider, again, think about the expansion, the GDP growth, the unemployment, the low inflation. This part is really tough for me to get my head around. It almost feels like a fever dream. But back in 98, the US federal government actually ran a budget surplus, which is not something that we're thinking about having to deal with today. It was actually the first surplus since 1969. So when you think about this, overall corporate profits were predictably solid. Capital markets were highly active, and this predictably spurred a lot of M&A activity in the period. Now, I'm going to detour away from the hard stats for a moment here to share an observation. This type of a growth environment that I just explained, in the midst of that unbounded tech enthusiasm, that readily available low-cost capital, the kind of general optimism that comes with that kind of activity paints a macroeconomic backdrop that I'm going to suspect, again, I probably wasn't paying enough attention back then, but I would suspect would encourage a lot more speculative or growth-oriented M&A activity generally. Conditions that right now, I would say outside of perhaps artificial intelligence companies and very promising new cutting-edge technologies, are simply not present. So that was the US. Now let's think about the global growth, because I think I maybe failed to mention earlier, the 700 deals that were involved in the KPMG study actually included a lot of international cross-border deals as well. So the global growth picture is also really important. Global economic growth from 96 and 98 was, let's call it moderately strong overall, but somewhat uneven. The IMF reported that in 96, global GDP growth was about 4%, slightly more than 4% in 97. And then we did have a material slowdown to about 2.5% in 1998. So the US, as we covered, as we discussed, was around 4% during this period. The EU was in a period of steady, not enormous, but steady expansion. And Japan was kind of going those early days of trying to get out from under their low growth and deflationary conditions that ultimately would persist for many, many years to come. Now, what was happening at the end of that period that sort of muted global growth? If you think back in 1997 to 98, there was an emerging markets financial crisis. I'm young enough to recall that it happened, or old enough to recall that it happened, and young enough to recall that I didn't really understand why it was happening at the time. So here's a couple of very high-level points there. The Asian financial contraction that started in 97 kicked off in Thailand and then spread to Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, and other so-called paper tigers, the paper tigers crisis. And this led to very sharp currency devaluations in those companies or countries, equity market sell-offs in those countries. Eventually, there were some IMF bailouts. And so as the world was processing that, it had been fueled by a lot of growth and investment and optimism in that region. There was a sharp correction. The next year, in 98, Russia defaulted on domestic debt. The ruble was devalued as a result. And this started a move, I would say, towards more risk aversion on a global scale, though arguably with a delayed fuse within the United States, because we still had a lot of reason for optimism within our borders.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
So overall, let's pan it back again. Overall, in the sample size of 700 global M&A deals in 96 to 98, we largely saw, as a backdrop, solid growth, synchronized expansion in advanced economies. And I'm suspecting that the same advanced economies that were under that expansionary environment were also largely where the sampled M&A deals were executed that were cited in the report. Similar to comments about U.S. conditions, this period would have created a lot of appetite, I think, a lot of appetite and a lot of confidence for taking big swings, placing large bets, and really pursuing bold M&A deals in developed economies. And this is going to be really important here because, of course, it's important for us to consider as a contextual factor, what was the environment in which those deals were actually performed. I think, again, I can't empirically support this, but if you have those kinds of general tailwind type, optimism-driven, enthusiasm-fueled conditions, you're going to see M&A deals that are a bit bolder, a bit more risk-on, a bit more generous with capital deployment, which of course is always going to arguably raise the hurdle, raise the bar for success in ultimately determining, was that transaction additive or dilutive to shareholder value? So let's now zoom in on M&A within agribusiness, because we have to ask ourselves, does some of this, does all of this actually apply to agribusiness? It seems like the macroeconomic environment is something that it's a variable we need to control for. If we're looking at this today, the conditions from the late 90s are not just different from what we're experiencing here in the mid 2020s, but they're also pretty divergent from other periods in recent history, depending on what time frame you look at. They're not, the late 90s are not like the stagflationary 70s. They're not really like the financial and industrial deregulation environment of the 1980s. They're certainly not like the systemic corrections that we experienced in the great financial crisis, with the bottoming out of the equity markets and home ownership and lending facilities going to zero. And they're certainly not like I'd say the muted growth period that followed the great financial crisis in the 2010s. And vibes matter too. So the kinds of deals you do in a world that is barreling towards economic integration, right? A world that's everyone's coming together to partner and to trade and to use their comparative advantages. That's going to create certain appetite for risk. an appetite for investment. Very different from sort of the targeted strategic fragmentation that we're seeing today, with supply chains being onshored or friendshored, looking to decouple in some critical aspects from antagonistic or potential enemy nations, if you want to say that. It's just a very different environment. That generalized exuberance of what an integrated global economy would look like is going to fuel M&A activity. And I also think, I can't weight this effectively, but it's worth noting there's a relative simplicity in the late 90s of a unipolar world where the US alone was sitting on top of the food chain compared to the complexities that we have today, where we have a rising economic, military, and diplomatic opponent via the strength in China. I just don't know that the backdrop of this study from 99 and the sample size of the sample data that it would then present really fits today. So again, not a methodological error, not a poor research approach, not a poor sampling strategy. I just think that the times were so different. We need to really think about if the conclusions, no matter how rigorously and effective that they were reached, actually apply today in 2025. But that aside, let's for the moment agree that the report's findings, the KPMG report from 99, that its findings are durable truths that exist across different macro environments. If that's true, should we believe that somewhere between 70 to 90% of M&A deals in agribusiness are likely to either fail to deliver or outright destroy value? Is it credible to say that only a fraction of the transactions that are done in our industry are additive to company shareholder value? Or in the case of a privately held company, the future prospects and enterprise value of that organization? I can't say this enough. I don't have empirical data. I'm not conducting a formal study. I'm a guy with a microphone, right? So this is a free podcast. You're going to get every penny, you can get your money's worth in this thing. But I have to say that I don't think so. I don't think that 70 to 90% failure rate can be reliably and predictably applied to agribusiness. I think that there are many deals that negatively impact shareholders, that negatively impact customers, that are net not a benefit to employees. But I don't know that we can lean on a stat from now 26 years ago in a world that doesn't exist anymore, and with a sample size of large global mega cross-border deals that may not reflect agribusiness domestically here. I don't think we can use that as a credible anchor or really a relevant reference point. There's lots of reasons for that, but let me give you a couple of the main reasons that I think we need to consider as we sort of figure out, should we be as worried about M&A as that headline statistic, that headline quote-unquote fact would tell us to be? I hinted at this a moment ago. The first challenge we have is, I think, just the size and the scope of the deals. The study that we know this, it looked at large transactions, often cross-border deals, and I think almost exclusively publicly listed companies. In fact, if they were looking at share data via Bloomberg for benchmark performance, they would have to be publicly listed. So yes, we're going to have Bunge-Viterra level mergers like we've just seen. We're going to have Bayer acquiring Monsanto. We've got those kinds of headline deals that would be perfect candidates to be popped into a new study if KPMG or another consulting firm was to do the same thing today. But most deals, certainly the deals that we talk about on this show, are going to fall below that waterline of criteria for a study like that. We think more on the high end about CHS acquiring West Central Ag Services, or Ceres Solutions and Co-Alliance merging to form Keystone Cooperative. And then a lot of smaller deals that are much more common as you go down in company size and cooperative size, whether it's in seed, feed, grain, ag retail co-ops, whatever it might be. We're looking at much smaller, largely domestic deals, certainly within the North American continent. The second piece here, aside from size and scope of deals, and I didn't mention this earlier, but it's the timing of analysis. And this is really, really important. Phase 2 of the KPMG report. So after they did all those interviews with the board members, they did that quantitative analysis of Bloomberg of looking at share data, share value data. And the analysis looked at share values, and they targeted the value of the company 12 months after the deal closed. Now, I don't know. maybe for public market investors across multiple industries, maybe that 12-month mark is a reliable benchmark. And that's a point at which you can fairly assess this value creation versus value destruction profile of a transaction. But I don't think personally that 1 year is a realistic period of review for ag deals. Certainly not the deals that we're involved in. Most transactions we've supported look at, a multi-year period over which they look to complete integration of processes. They look to rationalize their product offerings, their services, their assets. It's during that period they often launch an integrated go-to-market strategy. And they don't take a multi-year approach because they have an abundance of patience or they have low urgency. It's more due to the seasonal nature of the business and the biological constraints that you have on planting and nurturing and harvesting and then processing and distributing agricultural production. It doesn't simply fit into a clean 365-day countdown. If we don't stray from the 12-month mark as a time of measurement, if we take that as fact, take that as gospel in ag, I bet that ag deals probably see somewhere around 90% of deals failing to deliver value, especially in terms of friction, disruption, and all that capital being encumbered. So if you weigh the success of every deal 12 months after it closes, maybe we actually do fall into 90%. But I also don't know anyone who's tallying the score on day 365. They do a temperature check 1 year later, see where we're at, but that's not where they close the books and sort of give a final grade, right? Class continues. And the final thing that I would say that maybe gives me some doubts on whether or not the findings of the study can be applied, not just today, but to ag today, is I just think the margin structure and the margin opportunities in our industry and the capital availability are too fundamentally different. I don't want to go too far into this, but suffice to say, we collectively compete for very narrow margins in a largely commoditized volume game that we play. Oftentimes the richest margin for many agribusinesses is trading the market, not trading the product. And these narrow margins, they weigh down on the risks that we're willing to take. They are a factor in considering how much value we're willing to put into play and put at risk in pursuit of growth via M&A. And similarly, if as agribusinesses are maybe a little bit more prudent and careful and cautious in the kinds of transactions they'll pursue, the financial underwriting of deals, whether it's the board approving deployment of retained earnings, or if it's an ag lender providing a lending facility, or maybe it's actually a syndicate funding an acquisition, I suspect that they all stay close to the math, and that math is inherently conservative, which is going to further reduce how many aggressive edge case investment theses make it over the wall. And if fewer of those kinds of bold deals are getting funded, it's probably also reducing the odds of this dramatic failure rate. Again, that's just my gut feel. I feel like it's a logical chain of thought. I don't have facts to support that. None of this considers or controls for the strength of integration planning or execution, which has a lot of impact on the outcomes. We're not going to talk about what you can do to de-risk the acquisition from an integration standpoint. If you're interested in that, listen to almost any other episode that we have, and we talk about it a lot. But I think, again, all these factors suggest that we probably wouldn't replicate a 70 to 90% failure rate in agribusiness if we conducted this study today. I don't believe we would. Again, more gut feel than empirically proven, so take that with a grain of salt. So to close out today, so the stats might not be that bad. The study might not reflect our industry. The macroeconomic environment and the timing of the study certainly don't resonate today. So if the stats aren't that bad, so what? And this might be where you would expect me to start pumping you up to go chase M&A. But my take home after looking at this closely and thinking about how to tell the story today is it's how did I come personally to just accept the statement that 70 to 90% of M&A deals destroy or fail to deliver value? And more importantly, what other commonly held or rarely challenged nuggets of conventional wisdom am I running around with all day between the ears? Are they making me more confident than I ought to be sometimes, or more cautious than I need to be other times? And sheepishly, I need to really think about how often am I, with the best of intentions, repeating these half-truths. Hell, it's not in the headline banner of my website, but right there in the first paragraph, if you go to the website today, you'll see a statement that says many M&A deals destroy more value than they create. Now, maybe that word many is my hedge, right? Because what is many? Is many most? Is many significant? Is it some? Is it more than zero? It's very subjective. Many is certainly more, is more like, more than, saying many is certainly more likely than saying most. But the fact remains that I made the decision to put in writing on the digital storefront of my business years ago that this was a sort of a fact. It's presented as fact before I did the analysis that we just walked through today. So what else am I and you missing? And what are we going to do about it? For me, this is a reminder of that need to remain intellectually curious, to probe those commonly held truths. It's fine and it's comforting to have core principles and to keep them close in the way you position your business, the way you conduct your operations, the way you communicate your value. But I think we all have a responsibility to ourselves and to our teams as leaders of the business to do the work to really explore and understand the facts behind the things that we believe. So one of the other takeaways is I probably need to update my website, right? But the more that we explore these conventionally held wisdoms or facts, especially in the context of how they're actually driving some of the decisions that we make, who out there might have chosen to shy away from an acquisition simply because they heard, I heard that most of them are actually dilutive to value and it feels uncomfortable and I don't know that counterparty's culture and, the cost of capital is high and maybe you said no, which was the right decision, but you did it for all the wrong reasons. And so I think the more that we can explore these kinds of things, the more we can widen the aperture of our understanding, take some of the blinders off, the better we'll be. Deep exploration of these kinds of things, it might not change the things that you believe, but it might help you see where the things you believe are not always believable, at least not in the set of facts that you've been previously supporting them with. So that's kind of my journey today and trying to understand if M&A is actually as value destructive in agribusiness as we've been led to believe. I'm not convinced that it is. Obviously, there's a lot of variables to control for, a lot of things related to integration readiness, integration execution, the rigor of the analysis prior to the deal, the strategic alignment of the transaction, cultural fit, et cetera. There's a lot there. But on its face, I'm committing to starting to walk back that presumption that more often than not, you're going to fail if you do M&A, because I don't believe it's true today, and I don't believe it's true in agribusiness. Thank you all for listening to today's program and today's episode. I never take the time you spend listening to the podcast for granted, and I hope that this was of value to you. I'd love to hear what resonated with you, what maybe you didn't particularly understand or maybe didn't land with you, where there's some gaps in my thinking. That kind of feedback always helps improve the show. And also, if you did find value in this and you found interest in the topic, please consider sharing this with others that you feel would find similar benefit from it and how they lead and grow their agribusiness. I really appreciate you all being part of the Pacesetter Pod community and tuning in today. I look forward to having you join us right here next time on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.